scent of death clung to the stone walls of the great hall, a cloying mix of bitter herbs and decay that no amount of burning incense could mask. It was the scent of my wedding. I walked toward the dais, each step a final heartbeat of the life I once knew. The heavy ceremonial cloak, woven with the silver thread of my Alvara lineage, felt less like an honor and more like a shroud. My family name was the only thing of value I possessed, the price of this union. I was Carith Alvara, wolfless, an omega of a disgraced line, and today I would become the King's Luna, a title that was nothing more than a gilded cage built around a tomb. The pack watched me with 1,000 pitying eyes. Their whispers followed me like wraiths, hushed words of my barrenness, my incompleteness. A hollow Luna for a dying king, an empty vessel for a fading reign. They were not wrong. King Varric Dalmorn was a ghost haunting his own throne, a legendary alpha brought low by a creeping sickness that had silenced his wolf and withered his strength. The council had decreed this union a necessity, a way to bind my family's waning influence to the throne and provide a veneer of stability as the king wasted away. I was to be his comfort, his final queen, a pretty tragedy to mark the end of an era. The air grew colder as I approached the altar. He stood waiting, leaning slightly on a carved obsidian staff, the only thing, it seemed, that kept him upright. Even diminished, his presence was a physical force, a mountain eroded by a relentless storm. Varric was taller than I remembered, his frame gaunt beneath the weight of his black fur-lined robes. Scars mapped the hard plains of his face, old stories of battles won, but the deepest wounds were the new ones etched around his eyes, shadows of pain that never receded. He was not a man. He was a monument to what he had lost. As I drew my final steps, he lifted his head and his gaze met mine. There was no fire in his eyes, only the dull gray ash of a fire long extinguished. This was not a joining of souls. It was a shared funeral. The shaman, a withered elder with eyes like polished river stones, began the ancient rite. His voice was a dry rasp, reciting the words of the sacred bond, words that spoke of unity, strength, and eternity. Every syllable was a lie. There would be no eternity for us, only the handful of months the healers had granted him. There was no strength in this union, only the desperation of a pack facing the abyss. Zareth of the House of Alvara, the shaman droned, his voice echoing in the cavernous silence. Do you offer your loyalty, your spirit, and your life to the Alpha King, to bind your fate to his, until the moon falls from the sky? My throat was a knot of dust and fear. I was offering a life that was already forfeit, a spirit the pack deemed broken. I do, I whispered, the words barely audible. They felt like grit on my tongue. The shaman turned to the king. Varric of the House of Dalmorn, Alpha of the Black Moon Pack. Do you accept this offering? Do you claim this Luna as your own, to protect her, to honor her, and to bind your soul to hers, for all the days the mountain stands? Varric's response was a low rumble, torn from a chest that seemed to struggle with each breath. I do. It was the sound of a rock slide, distant and inevitable. Then let the bond be sealed, the shaman declared, raising his hands. Let the marking commence. This was the moment, the final irreversible act. Tradition dictated that he would mark me first, a bite to the neck that would forever brand me as his, but Varric was too weak. The council had amended the ritual, a quiet shame that hung in the air. Instead of a bite, we would join hands, a blood oath, a lesser bond for a lesser union. A tremor ran through me as the shaman produced a small silver dagger. He made a shallow cut across my palm first. The sting was sharp, and a line of crimson welled instantly, stark against my pale skin. The scent of my own blood, thin and wolfless, filled my senses, a scent of inadequacy. Then he turned to the king. Varric held out his hand, and for the first time, I saw the tremor in it, a fine, uncontrollable shiver that spoke of his profound weakness. The shaman drew the blade across his palm. Varric did not flinch, but a low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony. His blood was dark, sluggish, and it smelled of sickness, of dust and bitter roots. Join your hands, the shaman commanded. Let the blood mingle. Let the spirits recognize one another. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it, the point of no return. I raised my trembling hand, the blood dripping from my palm onto the cold stone floor. His gaze was fixed on me, those ash-gray eyes holding a universe of resignation. He was accepting his fate, and I was a part of it. Slowly, I reached out. The space between us crackled with a strange energy, the air growing thick and heavy. The pack held its collective breath. My fingers brushed his, and the world shattered. It was not a gentle touch. It was lightning striking dry earth. A searing, blinding heat shot up my arm, a current of raw power that felt like it was ripping my soul from my body. A gasp was torn from my throat, a sound of shock and pain. The air around us exploded with the scent of ozone and burning pine, chasing away the stench of death in an instant. But the true cataclysm was happening within him. Varric's body went rigid. A violent shudder racked his frame, so powerful it nearly sent him to his knees. His obsidian staff clattered to the floor. The hand holding mine clamped down with crushing strength, his fingers like iron bands around my own. A roar of something primal and furious ripped from his throat. Not a human sound, but the deep, guttural snarl of a wolf that had been silent for months. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, ignited. The gray ash was consumed by a blazing, molten gold, the incandescent fury of a true alpha. He stared at our joined hands, at the mingling of our blood, as if seeing a viper coiled there. His breath came in ragged, desperate pants, not from weakness, but from a sudden, overwhelming surge of vitality. Life, violent and untamed, was flooding back into him, a brutal, unwelcome torrent. Beneath his skin, I could feel it, a phantom presence, a great beast stirring from a long, drugged sleep. It was his wolf, clawing its way back from the brink. Awakened by the touch of my blood, it recognized something in me, something I didn't even know was there. The bond wasn't the quiet, symbolic thing the council had planned. It was a live wire, a conduit, and through it, my own life force was being siphoned away, feeding the starving creature inside him. The shaman stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. The pack elders surged to their feet, their faces pale with shock. This was not supposed to happen. The ritual was meant to be a quiet farewell. Instead, it was a resurrection. Varric's golden eyes snapped up to meet mine. The pain was still there, but it was different now. It was sharp, clear, and mingled with a dawning horror that was directed entirely at me. He wasn't just looking at me anymore. He was seeing through me, into the very core of the bond that had just snapped into place. He saw the ancient, terrible magic at work. He saw the exchange, his life for mine. The prophecy, the one whispered in shadowed corners and dismissed as old lore, slammed into his consciousness. When the dying king touches the hand of the hollow bride, the shadow's claim shall be reversed. The wolf will rise, and the Luna will fall. He understood. He finally understood the council's true gamble. They hadn't chosen me to comfort him in death. They had chosen me to be the sacrifice that would save him from it. His grip on my hand tightened, his knuckles white. The fire in his veins was my fire. The breath in his lungs was my breath. And the shadow that had been slowly consuming him was now turning, its hungry gaze fixing upon a new target, me. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His expression was one of absolute soul-shattering terror, not for himself, but for me. The pack saw a miracle, a king reborn, but in the blazing gold of his eyes, I saw my own death sentence being signed. He finally loosened his grip, his fingers pulling away as if my skin had burned him. As his touch left mine, a chilling cold seeped into my bones, a profound emptiness that hadn't been there moments before. It was the first taste of the shadow's claim. No, he finally choked out, the word a raw, broken thing. He looked from me to the stunned council members, betrayal and fury warring in his face. "What have you done?" Varric's question hung in the air, sharp and glittering as a shard of ice. "What have you done?" It was not the voice of a dying man. It was the roar of a king, a sound of thunder rolling back into a silent sky. And the entire pack flinched as if struck. The scent in the hall had changed. The cloying miasma of sickness was gone, ripped away and replaced by the potent, electrifying aroma of a dominant alpha in his prime. Ozone, cold mountain stone, and ancient pine. It was a scent of absolute power, and it had been absent for so long that its return was a shock to the system. Elder Kalen, the grizzled head of the council with a face like carved granite, stepped forward. His expression was not one of guilt, but of grim, unyielding resolve. "We have done what was necessary, my king. We have saved our pack." "Saved it?" Varric's laugh was a harsh, terrifying bark that held no humor. "You call this salvation? Tying my life to the destruction of an innocent? You have made me a parasite, a carrion feeder." He took a step toward them, and for the first time in a year, there was no weakness in his stride. There was only coiled, lethal strength. The council members instinctively took a step back. I stood frozen between them, the epicenter of the earthquake. The warmth from his hand had vanished, leaving a cold that was now seeping deeper into my marrow. It was more than a physical chill. It was an encroaching emptiness, as if the color and vibrancy of the world were being slowly leached away, leaving only shades of gray. I looked down at my palm. The cut the shaman had made was already a faint silver line, but the skin around it felt numb, dead. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I swayed, my vision tunneling. "The legends were clear," Kalen pressed on, his voice strained but firm, projecting for the entire hall to hear. "The Alvara line carries a dormant spark. In a wolfless omega, that spark is pure life essence, untethered to a beast. The prophecy spoke of a union that could reignite a dying alpha's flame. It was a sacrifice, yes. One life to preserve the king, and with him, the thousands of lives that depend on his strength. A sacrifice." He said the words so easily, as if speaking of a felled deer, not my life. My life, which had been deemed worthless by everyone, including myself, was now suddenly valuable enough to be currency for a king's. The irony was a bitter acid in my throat. I had spent my entire existence in the shadows, a disgrace for my lack of a wolf, a constant reminder of my family's fall from grace. They had treated me as less than nothing, an empty space at the table. And now they had found a use for that emptiness. They were using my hollowness to fill his. Varric's golden eyes blazed. "You speak of prophecy and sacrifice, Kalen. I speak of damnation. You have cursed me. You have bound my soul to a death sentence, and not my own." His gaze flickered to me, and the raw fury in his eyes was momentarily eclipsed by something else, something far more painful to witness, a profound and helpless agony. He was seeing the effects of the bond on me. He could probably smell the life draining from me, a scent like fading moonlight. His wolf was awake now, a restless, powerful presence just beneath his skin. I could feel it through the bond, a low thrumming that vibrated in my own chest. It was a magnificent, terrifying creature, tasting true vitality for the first time in months, and it was ravenous. It didn't understand the cost. It only understood the surge of life, the strength returning to its limbs, the fire rekindling in its blood. And it wanted more. It was drawing on me, pulling the very essence of my being through the newly forged connection, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. "She is your Luna now, Varric." Another elder chimed in, his voice trembling slightly. "The bond is sacred. It is done." "She is my prisoner," Varric snarled, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that sent shivers down my spine. "And I am her executioner." The world tilted again, more sharply this time. The torches lining the walls seemed to dim, their flames shrinking. The murmuring of the pack became a distant, buzzing drone. The cold was an ache in my bones now, a deep and settled weariness that felt ancient. I was 18 years old, but in that moment, I felt as though I had lived 1,000 years and was finally fading into dust. My knees buckled. Before I could fall, a hand shot out and clamped around my arm. It was Varric. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth against my spreading iciness. He pulled me upright with an ease that spoke of his newfound strength, a strength stolen directly from me. The contact was a dizzying paradox. His heat was a comfort against the cold, but I knew it was the very source of my decline. He pulled me slightly behind him, a subtle, protective gesture that shielded me from the accusing stares of the council and the pitying gazes of the pack. His body was a solid wall of heat at my back, and his scent, that overwhelming fragrance of winter and wilderness, enveloped me. For a split second, I felt safe. It was an absurd, impossible feeling. The man whose life was actively consuming mine was the only thing holding me up. "This ceremony is over, Vaude," he announced, his voice booming with an authority that had been missing for far too long. No one dared to argue. The council will answer to me, in private. He didn't wait for a response. His grip still firm on my arm, he turned and began to walk, pulling me along with him. The pack parted before us, a sea of stunned faces. Whispers followed in our wake, a mixture of awe at their resurrected king and a dawning, horrified understanding of the price. I was no longer just the hollow bride, I was the living sacrifice, and my slow walk to the altar had been replaced by a swift march to a different kind of grave. We left the great hall, plunging into the cold, silent corridors of the royal wing. The torches here flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for me. Every step was a monumental effort. The lethargy was getting worse, a heavy blanket being draped over my soul. Varric's pace didn't slow. He moved with the predatory grace of the alpha he was born to be, his long strides effortless. I had to nearly run to keep up, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He didn't speak. The silence between us was thick with unspoken horrors, charged with the violent energy of the bond that pulsed between us. I could feel his wolf, curious and proprietary, assessing me through that connection. It recognized me as its source of life, its mate, its Luna. And deep within my own wolfless soul, a tiny, forgotten part of me trembled in response to the sheer power of it. Finally, he stopped before a pair of immense, iron-bound oak doors. This was the entrance to his private chambers, a part of the castle that had been sealed since his illness had taken hold. He pushed one of the heavy doors open with one hand, the groan of the ancient hinges echoing in the empty hall. He led me inside and let the doors swing shut behind us with a deafening boom, plunging us into near darkness and an even deeper silence. The air inside was stale and thick with the dust of disuse. Faint moonlight filtered through a tall, arched window, illuminating the ghostly shapes of furniture. Draped in white cloths, this was the heart of his lair, the den of a great beast that had been waiting to die. He finally released my arm. The loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp. The cold rushed back in, more intense than before. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering, though the room was not cold. Varric moved to the window, his silhouette a stark, powerful shape against the pale light of the rising moon. For a long moment, he simply stared out at the night, his back to me. His shoulders were tense, the muscles in his back corded with strain. He was a man at war with himself, his body now a vessel of stolen life, his conscience a battlefield. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and raw, scraped clean of all bravado. "How much do you feel?" The question was so direct, so devoid of preamble, that it took me a moment to find my voice. I'm cold," I whispered, the words barely a puff of air. "And tired. So tired." He turned slowly, and in the dim light, I could see the torment carved into his features. The golden glow of his eyes had softened to a deep, molten amber, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart ache. "It will get worse," he said, his voice flat with grim certainty. "The bond is active. My wolf, it is drawing from you. It doesn't know it's killing you." Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and sharp, but I refused to let them fall. I had been raised to show no weakness, to bear my shame with quiet dignity. I would not break now. What happens to me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He walked toward me, closing the space between us until he stood just a breath away. He was so tall, a mountain of a man, and I had to crane my neck to look up at him. He smelled of the night, of power, of a life I would never have. He lifted his hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they came to rest gently against my cheek. His palm was calloused but incredibly warm. The touch was a fire against my icy skin, and an involuntary shudder ran through me. It was the most tender gesture I had ever received in my life. "The shadow that was feeding on me has now claimed you," he said softly, his thumb brushing over my cheekbone. "It will drain you, slowly at first, then all at once. The healers, they believe you have weeks, perhaps a month." A month. The word was a death knell, 30 days to fade into nothing. The tears finally welled over, tracing silent, cold paths down my cheeks. "I did not ask for this," he murmured, his voice thick with a self-loathing that was terrifying to behold. "Sereth, I swear to you, on my honor as king, I did not know. I believed him. The horror in his eyes was too real, too profound to be feigned. He was as much a victim of the council's plot as I was. He let his hand fall away, and the cold returned with a vengeance. He looked at me, his gaze holding mine, and I saw a vow being forged in the amber depths of his eyes. A vow of fire and iron. "They have tied your death to my life," he said, his voice a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the floor. "A bargain I will not accept. There must be a way to undo this, to sever the bond." He took a step back, a new fierce determination hardening his features. "I will find it. I will tear this castle apart stone by stone. I will hunt down every shaman, every scrap of ancient lore. I will not let you die for me." He paused, his eyes searching mine in the gloom, and the final words he spoke were not a promise, but a deadly oath that sealed our fates together in a way the wedding ceremony never could. "Even if it means I have to die myself." Varric's oath hung in the dusty air, a thing of terrible binding power, but the moment of connection, of shared desperation, was fleeting. He stepped back from me, and the king returned. The tormented man was gone, replaced by the alpha whose presence had once made mountains tremble. His jaw was set, his amber eyes hard as gemstones. He was no longer just my fellow captive. He was a monarch with a kingdom to command and a war to wage. "Guards!" His voice was not a shout, but a low command that resonated through the thick oak door as if it were paper. Within seconds, heavy footfalls echoed in the corridor. Stopping outside. The door creaked open, and two of his personal guard, wolves whose loyalty was to him and not the council, stood framed in the torchlight. Their eyes widened almost imperceptibly as they saw him, truly saw him. Standing tall, radiating power, no longer the shadow of a man they had been guarding. "Light the fires, bring blankets, food, wine," Varric ordered, his words clipped and precise. "And send word to Elder Kalen and the council. I will receive them here, now." The guards stared, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer force of his presence. "My king?" one of them stammered, his gaze flickering from Varric's powerful stance to me, huddled and shivering in the gloom. "You heard me," Varric growled, a dangerous undercurrent in his tone that promised violence. The guards snapped to attention, their shock replaced by ingrained obedience. "Yes, my king." They bowed low and vanished. He turned his attention back to me. He did not move closer, maintaining a careful distance, as if I were made of brittle glass. "You need to stay warm. The cold, it is a symptom of the drain." His voice was practical, almost clinical, a stark contrast to the raw emotion of moments before. He was compartmentalizing, shoving the horror of our situation into a box so he could function. I could only nod, wrapping my arms tighter around myself. The energy it took to speak felt monumental. I watched as he moved through the chamber, his chamber, with a restless, caged energy. He tore the white cloths from the furniture with sharp, angry movements, revealing a massive, fur-draped bed, heavy carved chairs, and a stone hearth large enough for a man to stand in. He was a storm contained within four walls, his wolf pacing just beneath his skin, tasting its newfound freedom and chafing against its new prison. The guards returned, their movements swift and silent. Within minutes, a roaring fire was crackling in the hearth, chasing the deepest shadows from the room and painting the stone walls in dancing shades of orange and gold. They laid a thick pile of wolf pelts and woolen blankets on a chaise lounge near the fire and placed a tray with bread, cheese, and a flagon of deep red wine on a small table beside it. They did all this without looking directly at me, their gazes averted as if I were a ghost. Perhaps I was. "Leave us," Varric commanded once they were finished. The guards bowed again and retreated, closing the doors and leaving us once more in profound silence, broken only by the hungry crackle of the flames. "Eat," he said, his back to me as he stared into the fire. "You need your strength." The irony was so cruel it was almost laughable. My strength was already feeding him. I looked at the food, the rich scent of it making my stomach clench, but I felt no hunger. It was another sign of the creeping emptiness. The simple human desires were fading first. Still, I sank onto the chaise and pulled a heavy fur blanket over my shoulders. The warmth was a blessing, a temporary reprieve from the ice in my veins. I forced myself to break off a piece of bread, the texture like sawdust in my mouth. It wasn't long before the council arrived. Their scents preceded them: the dry, papery smell of Kaelin, the sour scent of another's fear, the metallic tang of defiance from a third. Varric met them in the center of the room, a predator in his own den. He was a wall of muscle and fury, and the three elders looked small and frail before him. They did not bow. It was a calculated display of continued authority. Kaelin spoke first, his voice as unyielding as ever. "Varric, it is good to see the fire has returned to you. The ritual was a success." "A success?" Varric's voice was deceptively calm, a low rumble that was more menacing than any shout. "You call this abomination a success? You have tethered me to a dying woman. You have made her my sacrifice." I shrank deeper into the furs, wishing I could disappear. Their eyes slid to me, clinical and assessing. I was not a person to them. I was a component, a tool that had served its purpose. "The pack needed its alpha," Kaelin stated, his chin high. "Your sickness was a rot spreading through us. Rogues test our borders daily. The Eastern packs watch us like vultures. Without your strength, we would have been torn apart before the next full moon." Her life weighed against the thousands in this pack. The choice was simple mathematics. "It was not your choice to make," Varric roared, and the force of his voice made the very stones seem to vibrate. The wine in the flagon trembled. "Her name is Sereth. She is your Luna, and you sentenced her to death without a trial, without a voice. She is a wolfless omega from a fallen line," another elder spat, his fear making him cruel. "She had no future. We gave her purpose. We gave her a noble end. A noble end. To fade away into nothing, a human battery for their king." The bread turned to ash in my mouth. Varric took a menacing step forward, and the elders flinched. "Her purpose is whatever she chooses. Her end will not be as your sacrificial lamb." His gaze was chilling. "You invoked the old magic, the prophecy. You will tell me everything you know about it. Every word, every scroll you consulted. And you will tell me how to sever this bond." Kaelin's face was a stony mask. "There is no known way. The magic is absolute. The exchange is final. To sever the bond now would be to kill you both. The shock would extinguish both flames at once. The hope that had flickered within me died a swift, brutal death. Kill us both. So that was his choice. Watch me die, or die with me." "Liar," Varric growled. "No magic is absolute. There is always a loophole, a price. You will find it, or I will strip you of your titles, your land, and your names. You will be exiled, cast out as rogues for the vultures you so fear to feast upon. I give you until sunrise." The threat was absolute. Exile was a fate worse than death for a pack wolf. The elders paled, their arrogance finally cracking. For the first time, true fear scented the air. They saw the king they had created, and he was more ruthless than they had bargained for. "We will consult the archives," Kaelin ground out, his voice tight with fury and defeat. "But we make no promises, my king." "Then pray you find one." Varric dismissed them with a wave of his hand. They turned and fled, their departure far less dignified than their arrival. The room fell silent again. The confrontation had drained what little energy I had left. The world was beginning to feel muted, the vibrant colors of the fire dulling to a soft, hazy orange. Varric stood for a long time, his breathing heavy, the aftermath of his rage rolling off him in palpable waves. Finally, he turned to me, his expression grim. "We will not wait for them." He strode over to a section of the wall that looked like solid stone and pressed a specific block. With a low groan of grinding rock, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. The air that drifted out smelled of dust, leather, and decaying paper. A hidden library. "Come," he said, his voice softer now. He held out a hand to me. I hesitated. To take his hand was to invite that devastating, life-stealing connection, but to refuse was to admit defeat. I stared at his hand, large, scarred, the hand of a warrior and a king. The hand that had brought my death sentence crashing down upon me. With a trembling breath, I placed my own in his. The jolt was less violent this time, but the effect was more insidious. It was not a searing shock, but a deep, pulling current. A silent river dragging the warmth from my body and transferring it to his. I felt a wave of profound weakness wash over me, my legs threatening to give way. His grip tightened, steadying me, pulling me to my feet. He was a furnace of vitality, and I was a snowflake melting in his palm. He led me into the secret passage, pulling the stone door closed behind us. He lit a lantern with a piece of flint and steel, and the small flame cast a weak, flickering glow on towering shelves crammed with scrolls and leather-bound tomes. This was a place of secrets, the repository of his line's darkest and most ancient knowledge. The council only has access to the public archives, he explained, his voice a low echo in the cramped space. The answers, if they exist, will be in here. He released my hand, and I leaned against a bookshelf for support, the sudden return of the deep cold making me gasp. He began to move along the shelves, his long fingers tracing the faded spines of ancient books, his eyes scanning for anything that might help. He worked with a feverish intensity, pulling down heavy tomes and dusty scrolls, blowing centuries of dust from their surfaces. I watched him, a strange ache in my chest. This powerful, formidable alpha, whose name was whispered in fear and reverence across the continent, was now scrabbling through forgotten lore like a desperate scholar. All for me, for a wolfless Omega he had met only hours ago. His oath had not been a hollow promise. He was truly fighting for my life. An hour passed. The air grew thick with the smell of old parchment. The only sounds were the rustle of turning pages and Varric's low, frustrated curses. The fatigue was becoming unbearable. My eyelids were heavy as lead. I slid down the wall to sit on the floor, pulling the fur blanket tighter around me. The bond was a constant, draining hum in the back of my mind. Through it, I could feel the frantic energy of his wolf, its impatience, its possessiveness. It wanted him to claim his mate, to seal the bond fully, not understanding that the act would likely kill me instantly. "There's nothing," he finally said, slamming a heavy book shut with a loud thud that sent a cloud of dust into the air. Curses, blood magic, spirit packs. But nothing about a bond like this, nothing about how to sever it. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his frustration palpable. He looked over at me, his amber eyes shadowed with despair in the lantern light. As his gaze met mine, a wave of dizziness so intense it felt like the floor was dropping away from me, washed over me. I cried out, a small, choked sound. The lantern light fractured into 1,000 pieces. A sharp, stabbing cold pierced my chest, so painful it stole my breath. "Gareth!" He was across the room in 2 long strides, kneeling in front of me. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip hard. "What is it? What do you feel?" "Cold," I gasped, clutching at my chest. "It hurts." His face was a mask of horror. He could feel it. Through the bond he could feel the echo of my agony. His own breath hitched. And then the bond, that terrible living thing between us, did something new. For a split second, the library, the pain, my own fear, it all vanished. I was looking through his eyes. I felt the solid strength in his limbs, the frantic thrum of his powerful heart, the primal protective rage of his wolf roaring in his soul, demanding he protect his mate. I smelled my own scent, faint like crushed wildflowers in winter frost, and it filled me with a desperate, possessive longing. The sensation was gone as quickly as it came, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I stared up at Varric, whose eyes were wide with a new, dawning terror. "Did you?" he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. I could only nod, my heart hammering. He had felt it too. He had felt my encroaching death, and I had felt his raging life. We were no longer 2 separate beings tied together. The bond was merging us. He stared at me, his hands still gripping my shoulders. The frantic search was forgotten. The council was forgotten. In that moment, there was only the terrifying, undeniable truth of our shared existence. He was not just my executioner. He was becoming my co-victim. His expression shifted from horror to a grim, chilling resolve. He looked at me as if seeing the only solution, the only path left, and through the bond, I felt a flicker of his thought, a terrifying, sacrificial idea taking root in his mind, and my blood ran colder than it ever had before. If the bond cannot be severed. The echo of his thought, if the bond cannot be severed, faded, but the chilling implication remained, coiling in the space between us. I saw the answer in his eyes, a conclusion born of an alpha's ruthless logic and a king's capacity for sacrifice. If our lives were now a zero-sum game, he would be the one to forfeit. The idea was so stark, so absolute, it stole the air from my lungs. He would kill himself to save me. No, I whispered, the word fragile in the dusty silence. My own voice sounded foreign, a distant plea against an inevitable tide. Varric's hands tightened on my shoulders, his gaze unwavering. There may not be another way, Sereth. His voice was a low, guttural rasp, the sound of stone grinding against stone. He wasn't just considering it, he was accepting it. A king's duty was to his people, but an alpha's primal duty was to his mate. The two warring instincts were tearing him apart, and he had chosen the mate. He had chosen me. You can't, I insisted, finding a sliver of strength in my desperation. The council, Kaelin said severing the bond would kill us both. What if your death does the same? What if it just drags me with you? The possibility struck him. I felt it through the bond, a tremor of uncertainty, a flicker of doubt in his grim resolve. The thought of his death inadvertently causing mine was a new layer of hell he hadn't considered. He let out a harsh, frustrated breath and released me, surging to his feet. He began to pace the narrow confines of the hidden library, a caged wolf whose den had just become a trap with no exit. Then we are chained together, marching to your grave, he snarled, the words directed at the unseeing shelves of books. This is a crueler curse than I could have imagined. I watched him, my own panic giving way to a strange, hollow calm. The shadow's claim was not just a leeching of life, it was a slow erasure of feeling. The terror was still there, but it was muffled, as if happening to someone else. I could feel the cold seeping into the core of me, a permanent winter setting in. My life was no longer measured in years or months, but in breaths. Each one I took felt shallower than the last. Maybe the council was right, I said, the words tasting like ash. Maybe this is my purpose. He stopped pacing instantly and whirled on me. His eyes were blazing furnaces in the lantern light. Do not ever say that. He crossed the space between us in a single fluid stride and crouched before me again. He didn't touch me, but his proximity was a physical force, a wall of heat and power. Your purpose is not to be kindling for my flame. Your life is your own. I will not have it. Do you understand me, Sereth? I will not have it. The vehemence in his voice was staggering. No one had ever spoken of my life as if it held intrinsic value. To my family, I was a shame. To the pack, a burden. To the council, a tool. But to this man, this king who was bound to me by a parasitic magic, my life was a thing to be fought for, to be defended with a ferocity that bordered on madness. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on my cheek. He saw it and his expression fractured, the anger giving way to that raw, helpless agony I had seen before. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face, then seemed to remember the consequence of his touch, and drew it back, clenching it into a fist at his side. The simple, aborted gesture was more intimate than any touch. Sunrise is coming, he said, his voice strained. Kaelin will return. They will have found nothing, and they will expect me to accept this, to accept you as the price for my recovery. He looked away from me, his gaze turning inward. They will be disappointed. He rose and offered me his hand once more. This time I did not hesitate. As my fingers met his, the familiar draining current began, but I focused on the warmth, on the solid strength of his grip as he pulled me to my feet. Every touch was a trade, a moment of his strength for a piece of my life. We returned to his chambers. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and the first pale gray light of dawn was filtering through the high window. The room felt different. It was no longer a tomb, but a king's chambers, awake and alive, filled with his scent and the restless energy of his presence. He led me to the chaise and gently pushed me down, covering me with the furs. Rest, he commanded softly. The less energy you expend, the slower the drain. I wanted to argue, to say that I couldn't rest, but the exhaustion was a physical weight pressing me down. My eyes fluttered closed of their own accord. As I drifted on the edge of consciousness, I heard the heavy doors open. I didn't have the strength to open my eyes, but I could smell them. The council had returned. Well, Varric's voice was a low growl, devoid of any hope. My king, Kalen's voice was strained, formal. We have searched the archives, as you commanded. The prophecy is obscure. It speaks of the hollow bride and the fading king. It details the transfer of life, the reawakening of the Alpha's wolf. I am aware of the effects, Kalen, Varric bit out. I asked for a solution, a reversal. There was a heavy silence. Then Kalen spoke, his voice dropping. There is no reversal. The texts are clear. The bond is a one-way conduit. Life essence once given cannot be recalled. However, Varric's tone was sharp, laced with sudden, desperate attention. There is a mention, a whisper, not of severing the bond, but of balancing it. My heart, which had been beating with a slow, lethargic rhythm, gave a painful thud. I forced my eyes open. The three elders stood before Varric, their faces grim. Kalen held a thin, ancient-looking scroll. What do you mean, balancing? Varric demanded. The texts speak of the Alpha's blood, Kalen explained, his eyes flickering toward me. If the drain on the Luna becomes too rapid, it is said that the Alpha can supplement her. A willing offering of his own blood given directly, it will not stop the drain, it will not save her, but it will slow it. It buys time. Time. The word was a splash of cold water. It wasn't a cure, but it was a reprieve. How? Varric's question was immediate, practical. A ritual. At the heartwood of the old forest, where the moon is brightest, the Alpha must open a vein and the Luna must drink. It is an act of supreme intimacy, of shared life and shared death. It strengthens the bond, deepens the connection, even as it prolongs the inevitable, strengthens the bond. The thought sent a shiver of fear through me. Our connection was already terrifyingly intimate. What would it become if we were to literally share his blood, his life force? That brief, disorienting moment of seeing through his eyes, feeling his wolf, would that become more frequent, more permanent? It is a dangerous path, the third elder warned, his voice shaking, to intertwine your souls so deeply. The legends say it can drive both parties mad. You will feel her fading, King Varric, every moment of it. And she will feel your power, a constant reminder of what she can never have. It is a refined and elegant form of torture. Varric was silent for a long moment, processing their words. He turned his head, and his gaze met mine across the room. I was fully awake now, propped up on one elbow, the furs pooled around me. He saw the question in my eyes, the terror and the sliver of hope. Prepare the ritual, he said to the council, his voice leaving no room for argument. His eyes never left mine. Tonight. Kalen nodded, a flicker of something unreadable, relief, respect, in his old eyes. As you command, my king. He and the others bowed, a gesture of true deference this time, and left us alone once more. The day passed in a blur. I was too weak to move from the chaise, drifting in and out of a shallow, restless sleep. Varric did not leave my side. He sat in a heavy carved chair near the fire, watching over me, a silent, brooding guardian. He did not read, he did not speak. He just watched, his expression a mask of grim determination. Through the bond, I could feel the war raging within him. His wolf, primal and possessive, was thrilled at the prospect of the blood ritual, seeing it as a step toward a true mating. But the man, the king, was horrified, viewing it as a desperate, monstrous act to keep a ghost tethered to the world of the living for a few more precious days. As dusk fell, painting the room in hues of purple and blood orange, he finally spoke. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low and soft. I thought for a moment. The fear was there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by the profound weariness, the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. "I'm too tired to be afraid," I confessed, my voice a mere whisper. He closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "I am afraid enough for both of us," he admitted. When the moon was high, the guards returned. They brought a simple dark cloak for me. Varric lifted me from the chaise as if I weighed nothing. For a terrifying moment, I was in his arms, pressed against the solid wall of his chest. My face was buried in the crook of his neck, and his scent, pine, snow, and something uniquely, powerfully him, filled my senses. The contact was an agony and an ecstasy. I felt life being siphoned out of me at an alarming rate, a dizzying rush of weakness, but at the same time the sheer protective strength of his hold was the safest I had ever felt. He set me on my feet, holding me steady as he draped the cloak over my shoulders. "It is time," he said. We walked through the silent castle, 2 of his personal guards leading the way with torches, 2 more following behind. We were a somber royal procession on our way not to a coronation, but to a dark and desperate sacrament. We passed out of the castle gates and into the ancient forest that bordered it. The air here was different, alluring breathing. It smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, clean scent of pine. The full moon was a perfect silver disk in the sky, casting the woods in an ethereal, black and silver light. The path grew wilder, the trees older and more gnarled, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. Finally, we reached a small clearing. In the center stood a single, enormous heartwood tree, its bark pale as bone in the moonlight, its vast canopy blocking out the stars. This was a place of old power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. The air hummed with a latent magic that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The guards formed a protective circle around the clearing, their faces grim, and then turned their backs, giving us privacy for what was to come. Varric led me to the base of the great tree. He turned to face me, and in the stark moonlight, his face was a study in conflict and sorrow. The golden amber of his eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. "Sereth," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I would give anything to undo this, to take your place." "I know," I whispered. Without another word, he drew a small, wicked-looking dagger from his belt. The blade was obsidian, black and gleaming. He held his left arm out, palm up. The moonlight caught on the network of old scars there, but he ignored them, positioning the tip of the blade over the tender skin of his wrist, directly over the heavy, pulsing vein. His eyes met mine, holding my gaze. "Do not be afraid." Then with a single smooth motion, he drew the blade across his skin. The obsidian blade sliced through Varric's flesh with a faint wet sound that was shockingly loud in the silent clearing. Dark blood, almost black in the moonlight, welled up instantly. It did not flow sluggishly as it had during our wedding ceremony. It pulsed, a strong, steady rhythm that spoke of the roaring life now coursing through his veins. My life. His eyes never left mine, his expression a mask of agonizing resolve. He held his bleeding wrist out to me, an offering both sacred and profane. The scent of his blood hit me like a physical blow. It was nothing like the thin, wolfless scent of my own. His was a potent, intoxicating aroma of ancient forests, of winter storms, of raw, untamed power. It was the scent of the wild, the scent of the wolf, and it awakened a primal, desperate thirst deep within me that I had never known existed. My body trembled. This was wrong, a monstrous act. But the cold in my bones, the deep, settled weariness that had become my constant companion, cried out for the warmth his blood promised. My own life, faint as a flickering candle flame, yearned for the inferno he offered. "Sereth," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Drink." Hesitantly, I raised my shaking hands and took his wrist. His skin was hot beneath my cold fingers. The steady, powerful beat of his pulse vibrated through my palms, a frantic drumbeat of life. I looked from the raw, open wound to his face. The pain of the cut was nothing to him. The true agony was in his eyes, in the terrible necessity of this act. He was asking me to feed on him, to partake in a ritual that bound us closer in this shared damnation. I bent my head. The scent was overwhelming now, filling my head, drowning my senses. My lips brushed against his skin, and a shudder racked his entire body. I felt it through the bond, a jolt of pure, agonizing sensation, the scorching touch of my cold lips against his fever-hot skin, the desperate need of his wolf to pull me closer, to claim me, to mark me properly. It was a dizzying torrent of his feelings, his desires, crashing into the quiet emptiness of my own soul. I pressed my lips to the wound. The first taste was of salt and heat and power. It was not just blood, it was life itself, concentrated and pure. It slid over my tongue like liquid fire, chasing the deep, unending cold from my mouth, from my throat. A wave of warmth spread through my chest. The first true warmth I had felt since our hands had joined. It was a sunrise breaking within me, a resurrection. I drank. The primal, instinctual part of me took over. The part that wanted to live. I was no longer Therese Alvara, the disgraced Omega. I was a dying creature clinging to a lifeline, and I drank from it with a desperation that shamed me. Varric's breath hitched. A low groan was torn from his chest, a sound of both exquisite pain and something else, something deeper and more complex. I felt it through the bond, the sensation of his life force flowing into me, the weakening in his own limbs as strength flooded mine. But mingled with the drain was a current of pure, possessive pleasure. His wolf was exultant. This was the ultimate act of ownership. His blood, his life, was now inside me, marking me from the inside out. He was claiming his mate in the most fundamental way possible. The world behind my closed eyelids began to change. The darkness dissolved into a chaotic swirl of images, of feelings, of memories that were not my own. I saw a blizzard on a high mountain pass, felt the sting of wind-driven snow on his face. I felt the savage joy of a first hunt, the power of muscles bunching and releasing, the exhilarating speed of 4 paws tearing through a forest floor. I smelled the blood of a rival alpha on my hands and tasted the bitter tang of a necessary betrayal. I was seeing his life. The bond, fortified by his blood, had become a window into his soul. The warmth was a roaring bonfire now, pushing back the encroaching shadow. The gray veil over my vision burned away, and the colors of the world returned with a startling, painful intensity. The silver of the moonlight, the deep green of the moss on the heartwood tree, the impossible, blazing amber of his eyes. My heart, which had been beating with a slow, tired flutter, began to pound with a strong, steady rhythm that matched his. The stabbing ache in my chest was gone. I pulled back, gasping, my lips stained dark with his blood. The world was sharp and clear, almost painfully so. The fatigue was gone, replaced by a thrumming energy, a vitality that felt borrowed and illicit. I looked up at Varric. His face was paler now, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. He was leaning more heavily against the ancient tree, the hand not held by mine, braced against the trunk for support. I had taken something from him, not just blood, but a measure of his strength. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable. The pain and horror were still there, but they were now mingled with a stunned, profound awe. The bond between us had changed. It was no longer just a parasitic drain. It was a two-way street, a turbulent, swirling river of shared sensation and emotion. He could feel the life returning to me, the warmth spreading through my limbs, and I could feel the slight tremor of weakness in his. We were a closed circuit, a perfect, terrible system of exchange. "It worked," I whispered, my voice stronger than it had been in days. "For now," he said, his voice strained. He pulled his wrist from my grasp and tore a strip of cloth from his tunic, wrapping it tightly around the wound. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. "It bought you time, nothing more." But it felt like more. It felt like a breath of air to a drowning woman. I could stand on my own. The world did not tilt when I moved my head. I felt alive. And it was the most addictive, terrifying feeling I had ever known. How could I ever go back to the gray emptiness after tasting this? "The elder was right," Varric said, his voice low as he watched my face. "This is a torture." He was right. To be given this reprieve, this taste of true vitality, only to have it inevitably fade, it was crueler than a swift end. Every beat of my now strong heart was a reminder that it was beating on borrowed time, with borrowed life. His wolf, however, was not concerned with the future. It was consumed by the present. Through the bond, I felt its raw satisfaction. It was a possessive, triumphant hum that vibrated in his chest. Mine, the feeling seemed to say. Mine to protect. Mine to feed. Mine. The strength of its emotion was so powerful it was almost my own. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in my chest, a feeling of being cherished, of being wanted, that had nothing to do with the life-giving properties of his blood. It was the wolf's affection, its claim, and it was directed at me. "We should go back," Varric said, pushing himself away from the tree. He was steady on his feet, but I could feel the subtle effort it took. He was an ocean of power, and I had taken but a single cup, yet even he could feel the loss. As we turned to leave the clearing, a sudden, piercing howl split the night. It was not from one of our guards. It came from deeper in the forest, a wild, mournful sound filled with challenge and hunger. Rogue. Instantly, Varric's guards materialized from the shadows, forming a tight circle around us, their hands on the hilts of their swords. Varric pushed me behind him, his body a solid shield. His own posture changed, his shoulders broadening, his head lifting as he scented the air. He let out a low growl, a sound that was pure alpha, a rumbling threat that vibrated through the soles of my feet. It was a warning. This is my territory. This is my Luna. Stay back. Another howl answered, closer this time, and another. It wasn't one rogue. It was a pack. My king of Faz, the captain of his guard said, his voice tense. They are bold. They must have sensed your previous weakness. My weakness is gone, Varric stated, his voice cold iron. Let them come and test my recovery. But I knew the truth. They were not just sensing his recovery. They were smelling me. They were smelling the ritual. The air was thick with the scent of his spilled blood, a powerful lure. But now it was mingled with my own scent, which had changed. Before, I smelled of nothing, of absence. Now, infused with his blood, his life, my scent was a beacon. I smelled of an omega, yes, but an omega claimed by a powerful alpha, an omega brimming with a stolen, potent life force. To a hungry rogue pack, I was an irresistible prize, a source of power to be taken. The rustling in the undergrowth grew louder. The circle of guards tightened. Varric drew his own sword, the sound of steel sliding from its scabbard unnervingly loud. The moonlight glinted off the long, deadly blade, and then they came. They burst from the trees not as men, but as wolves. Great, shaggy beasts, larger and leaner than pack wolves, their eyes glowing with a feral yellow light. There were at least a dozen of them, their lips pulled back from their teeth in silent snarls. They didn't howl now. They were hunting. The guards met them with swords and shouts. A clash of steel on fang and claw. The clearing erupted into a maelstrom of violence. It was a brutal, bloody dance in the moonlight. Varric did not join the fray. He stood his ground in front of me, his sword held ready, his body a living wall between me and the battle. His focus was absolute. He was a king, but in that moment, his entire kingdom had shrunk to the space I occupied. One of the rogue wolves, a massive beast with a scarred muzzle and matted black fur, broke through the guard's line. It ignored the swordsman and launched itself directly at us, its yellow eyes fixed on me. It was the alpha, and it wanted the prize. It happened in a blur of motion. The beast lunged, its jaws snapping, aiming for my throat. I screamed, stumbling backward. But Varric moved faster than seemed humanly possible. He didn't use his sword. He dropped it, and with a roar that was more wolf than man, he met the creature's charge with his own body. He caught the great wolf in midair, his hands sinking into the thick fur of its ruff. The impact was tremendous, but Varric's feet only slid back a few inches. For a heart-stopping moment, they were locked in a primal struggle, man against beast. The wolf snarled and snapped, its claws tearing at Varric's arms, but his grip was iron. And then, with a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated dominance, Varric twisted. There was a sickening crack of bone that echoed through the clearing. The wolf went limp in his arms. He threw the massive, dead creature aside as if it weighed nothing. He stood breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, blood from the wolf's claws welling on his forearms. He turned to me, his amber eyes blazing with the fire of battle, with the fury of his protective instincts. The man was gone. In his place was the alpha, the predator, the king of wolves. He saw the terror on my face, and his expression softened, just for a fraction of a second. He took a half-step toward me, and then he stopped. His eyes widened, not with anger, but with a new, dawning horror. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my hands. I followed his gaze. I had thrown my hands up to shield my face when the wolf lunged. They were still there, trembling in the air in front of me. And from the tips of my fingers, shimmering in the moonlight, grew long, sharp, unmistakable claws of shadow and silver light. The claws were not real, not solid. They were constructs of shimmering, semi-translucent energy, moonlight given form and purpose, tipped with the deep black of a starless night. They were beautiful and terrifying, an extension of my own fingers, humming with a power that felt both alien and intimately familiar. I stared at them, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. I was wolfless, an omega, a hollow vessel. Such a manifestation of power was impossible. The sounds of the battle faded to a dull roar in the background. My entire universe had shrunk to the space between my own hands and Varric's horrified, disbelieving gaze. The thrumming energy that had filled me after the blood ritual was now concentrated in my hands, spilling out of me, taking this impossible shape. It was his power, his life force, being channeled through me and twisted into something new, something that was neither his nor mine. "Zareth," Varric breathed, his voice a raw whisper of awe and terror. He took a cautious step toward me, his battle fury completely forgotten. As he moved closer, the spectral claws wavered and dissolved, vanishing into faint wisps of silver smoke that curled around my fingers and then were gone. I was left staring at my own pale, empty hands, which were trembling violently. Had I imagined it? But the look on Varric's face told me it was real. The distraction was almost fatal. From the corner of my eye, I saw another rogue, leaner and faster than the alpha, slip past the guards. It had been circling, waiting for an opening, and Varric's momentary focus on me had provided it. It didn't lunge, it sprang, a silent gray blur, aiming for Varric's unprotected side. There was no time to shout a warning. There was no time to think. There was only a surge of pure primal terror for him. My own life, his life, our cursed, intertwined existence. It all funneled into a single, desperate impulse. Protect him. I threw my hands out again, not in defense of myself, but toward the attacking wolf. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what to expect. I only knew that I could not let it reach him. This time, it wasn't claws. A wave of force, visible as a shimmering distortion in the moonlit air, erupted from my palms. It was not a physical blast, but a wave of pure, concentrated sensation. It was the feeling of absolute, soul-crushing despair. The shadow's claim, the encroaching emptiness that had been consuming me, was weaponized. The wolf was 2 feet from Varric when the wave hit it. The creature yelped, a sound of pure agony, and its lunge faltered. It stumbled, its powerful limbs suddenly uncoordinated. It collapsed onto its side, whining, its body convulsing. It wasn't wounded, not physically, but its feral yellow eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of a hunter. It was the terror of oblivion. It was feeling what I had been feeling for days, the slow, cold erasure of its own life force. I had pushed the shadow onto it. The effort was catastrophic. The borrowed energy, the warmth from Varric's blood, vanished in an instant, consumed by the incredible exertion. It was like a dam breaking. The cold rushed back in, 1,000 times more powerful than before. It was an Arctic tsunami, a physical blow that buckled my knees. The world went gray, then black at the edges. The last thing I saw before I collapsed was Varric whirling around, his face a mask of shock, his amber eyes wide as he looked from the convulsing wolf back to me. The last thing I felt was the hard, cold earth rising up to meet me. I drifted in a sea of gray nothingness. There was no pain, no fear, just a profound and final exhaustion. This was it then. The end. I had spent my one burst of stolen life to save his. The trade seemed fair. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. A quiet sense of peace settled over me. There was no more struggling, no more fighting, only release. But something was pulling me back. A voice, distant and desperate, calling my name. A warmth, a searing heat, trying to pierce the encroaching ice. "Zareth, Zareth, open your eyes. Stay with me." It was Varric. His voice was a lifeline, a thread of sound in the crushing silence. I clung to it. With a monumental effort that felt like lifting a mountain, I forced my eyelids to flutter open. The world swam back into focus. I was lying on the forest floor, my head pillowed in Varric's lap. The battle was over. The remaining rogues had fled, dragging their wounded with them. The bodies of the dead, both wolf and guard, lay still in the moonlit clearing. But my world was Varric. He was leaning over me, his face pale, his eyes wild with a frantic, desperate fear that dwarfed anything I had seen in them before. Blood from the cuts on his arms dripped onto my cloak, dark blossoms on dark wool. "You're cold," he said, his voice cracking. "Gods, you're like ice." His hands were on my cheeks, his touch a desperate attempt to share his warmth, but I could barely feel it. The cold was inside me now. It was what I was. I pushed it, I whispered, my voice a dry rustle of leaves. I know, he said, his own voice thick with a strangled emotion. I saw, Sareth, what was that? The shadow, I breathed. I think I gave it to the wolf. His eyes widened in horrified understanding. I had channeled the very thing that was killing me. He looked over at the rogue wolf. It was still alive, but barely. It lay on its side, its breathing shallow, its powerful body shrunken and frail. It looked ancient, withered. It was dying the same slow, wasting death that had been planned for him, and then for me. It's not enough, he murmured, his gaze snapping back to me. You used too much. You gave everything. Sareth, you're fading. He was right. I could feel it. The edges of my being were dissolving, becoming one with the cold, silent night. My connection to the world was a fraying rope. Even the bond between us felt thin and distant. No, he said, his voice dropping to a fierce, determined growl. He shook his head, denying it, refusing it. I will not let you. He shifted, gathering me into his arms. He lifted me from the ground as if I were a child, my head lolling against his shoulder. His strength was a stark, brutal contrast to my utter lack of it. Back to the castle, he roared at his guards. Now! The journey back was a waking dream. I was aware of the jostling motion, of the dark trees flashing past, of the grim, worried faces of the guards. But mostly, I was aware of Varric. His arms were a cage of iron around me, his body a furnace against my back, his heart hammered against my ear, a frantic, desperate rhythm. And through the thin, wavering thread of our bond, I felt his terror, his rage, his absolute screaming refusal to let me go. He was pouring his own energy into me, a constant, willful flow of warmth and life, trying to hold the shadow at bay. It was a futile effort, like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands, but he did not stop. We burst back into his chambers. He didn't place me on the chaise. He strode to the massive, fur-draped bed and laid me down gently amidst the soft pelts. The fire had been stoked, and the room was warm, but the heat could not touch the cold that emanated from me. He stood over me, a great, powerful figure, undone by helplessness. The king who could kill a monstrous wolf with his bare hands could do nothing to stop the life from seeping out of my body. There must be a way, he whispered to himself, pacing before the bed like a caged panther. The blood. It wasn't enough. It only gave you the strength to spend. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The bond, it's a conduit. Life flows from you to me. His blood ritual allowed a trickle to flow back, but it's not enough to refill what's been taken. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a desperate, calculating light. It's a one-way street, Kaelin said, but he's wrong. It can't be. All magic has a price, a balance. He began to mutter, piecing together fragments of lore, of prophecy, of what he had just witnessed. The hollow bride, untethered life essence. The Alpha's wolf. He fell silent, his gaze fixed on my face, but his eyes were looking through me, seeing the shape and structure of the magic that bound us. And then his expression changed. A dawning, terrible understanding filled his eyes. It was the same look he'd had in the hidden library, when he had first decided to sacrifice himself. But this was different. It was sharper, more certain. He hadn't found a loophole. He had found the price. The exchange, he breathed, the words barely audible. It isn't just life for life. The prophecy, it was incomplete. It's an exchange of natures. He knelt by the bed, taking my icy hand in his. His touch was scorching. Sareth, you were wolfless, hollow. Your life force was pure, unanchored. It fed my wolf, woke it up, healed it. But that wasn't the end of the transaction. He looked from my face to my hand, the hand that had manifested claws of shadow and light. It made a space inside you, an empty vessel, and my nature, my wolf, is starting to fill it. It was insane, impossible, and yet it was the only thing that made sense. The claws, the wave of despair. It wasn't my power. It was an echo of his, filtered through me. What happened tonight? You using that power, it accelerated everything, he continued, his voice tight with urgency. It tore the vessel wide open. The shadow is rushing in to fill the void. But if I can fill it first. He trailed off, his gaze intense, searching my face. I didn't understand. What could he do? The marking, he said, his voice low and heavy with significance. The true marking, the bite. My heart, which I could barely feel beating, gave a painful lurch. The marking was the final seal on a mating bond. It would intertwine our souls, our very life essences, completely and irrevocably. Kaylin had said the shock of severing the bond would kill us both. What would the shock of completing it do to me in this state? The council avoided it because they thought I was too weak, and you were just a vessel for the ceremony, he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. But it's the key. It's the final part of the ritual, the final clause in the magical contract. It won't just claim you as my mate. It will force my nature into you. It will anchor my wolf's spirit within you. It won't give you a wolf, not a true one, but it will fill that emptiness with an echo of mine. It will give the shadow no place to take hold. It was a desperate gamble, a wild theory based on fragmented lore and a single terrifying manifestation of power. It could kill you, he admitted, his voice raw. The shock. The influx of that much power when you are this weak. It could shatter you. I looked into his eyes, into the amber depths where a king's resolve warred with a man's terror. He was offering me a chance. A terrifying, painful, uncertain chance, but a chance nonetheless. The alternative was to lie here and fade into nothing. My choice was no choice at all. I couldn't speak, but I squeezed his hand, a faint, flickering pressure. It was enough. A look of grim, heartbreaking determination settled on his face. He leaned over me, his body shielding me from the rest of the world. He lowered his head, his hair brushing against my cheek. His breath was warm against my skin. "Forgive me," he whispered. And then I felt the sharp pressure of his fangs against the tender flesh of my throat. 3 months. I stood on the stone balcony of the king's chambers, a fine woolen cloak wrapped around my shoulders, and watched the full moon hang like a pearl in the ink-black sky. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow from the mountain peaks. It was cold, a clean and natural chill that I welcomed. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the cold was on my skin, not in my bones. The shadow was gone. The marking had not been a gentle salvation. It had been an agony, a fire, a war, waged within the confines of my own soul. When Varric's fangs had pierced my skin, it was not just his essence that flooded me, but the full, untamed spirit of his wolf. It was a tidal wave of primal power, of ancient instinct, of pure alpha dominance, crashing into the fragile emptiness within me. The shock had nearly torn me apart. For days I lay in a fever dream, caught between two opposing forces. The shadow, the cold void, fought to claim the hollow space I represented, and the echo of Varric's wolf, a blazing golden predator, fought to fill it, to burn the shadow out, to claim the territory as its own. I had been the battlefield, and in the end, a balance had been struck. I was not a shifter. I did not have a wolf of my own, a second form to slip into beneath the moonlight. The wolfless Omega I had been born as was, in essence, what I remained. But I was no longer hollow. The emptiness inside me had been filled, imprinted with the spiritual echo of Varric's wolf. It lived within me now, a quiet, slumbering power, a constant, comforting warmth where the ice had once been. It was a permanent anchor tying my soul to his, a presence that hummed in tune with the great beast that paced beneath his skin. I lifted my hand in the moonlight. I could still summon them if I concentrated. The claws of shadow and light, they were my inheritance from that terrible battle, a manifestation of the balance I now embodied. They were made of the life he had given me, and tempered by the death that had claimed me. A paradox, a weapon, a reminder. The heavy doors to the chamber slid open, and I didn't need to turn to know it was him. I felt his presence not just as a sound or a shift in the air, but as a resonant thrum deep within my chest, the echo inside me singing in recognition of its source. His footsteps were silent on the stone as he came to stand behind me, his body a familiar wall of heat. Strong arms wrapped around my waist, pulling me back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his warm breath ghosting across my neck, near the place where a faint silver scar now resided. It was no longer a wound, but a seal, a promise. "You'll catch a chill," he murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble that vibrated through me. "Never again," I answered softly. Leaning my head back against his shoulder, I covered his hands with my own, lacing our fingers together. The simple touch was no longer a transaction of life and death. It was just a touch, filled with a warmth that was mutual, shared, and endless. Our bond was no longer a parasitic curse or a desperate two-way channel of survival. It was a placid, deep river, a constant, silent current of affection, of awareness, of absolute belonging that flowed between us. I could feel his contentment, his quiet strength, and the fierce, unwavering love that was always directed at me. "The moon is beautiful tonight," he said, his gaze following mine to the sky. "It suits you," I smiled. The moon was no longer a harbinger of a fate I could not participate in. It was simply part of our world. "And the pack is quiet," I noted, closing my eyes, extending my new senses. I could feel them, a sprawling, interconnected web of minds and spirits spread throughout the valley. I could not hear their individual thoughts, but I could feel the tenor of their collective soul, content, secure, strong under the rule of their restored king and his unusual Luna. They no longer looked at me with pity or scorn. They looked at me with a mixture of awe and reverence. I was the Luna who had brought their king back from the grave, the wolfless Omega who had faced down a pack of rogues and survived the Shadow's claim. My quiet, broken existence had been burned away, and from the ashes, a new life had been forged. "What happened to them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Kaelin and the others." Varric was silent for a moment. "They were not exiled," he said finally. "Exile would have been an easy death. I gave them a harder sentence. They were stripped of their titles, their lands, their places on the council. They now serve the pack. Kaelin, the great strategist, oversees the kitchens. Lauren, who called you an empty vessel, cleans the kennels. They will spend the rest of their days in humble service, a constant living reminder that no life is worthless, and no soul is a mere tool for the ambitions of others. It was a just and fitting punishment, a king's justice, tempered by the wisdom of a man who had stared into the abyss. He turned me in his arms, his hands framing my face. His amber eyes, free of all shadows and pain, glowed with a deep, consuming adoration. "I almost lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with the memory. "In that clearing, and again, on that bed, I have faced armies and beasts, Kareth. I have never known a terror like the thought of my world without you in it. But I am here," I said, raising a hand to touch the old scar on his cheek. "You saved me." "No," he shook his head, a fierce, passionate light in his eyes. "We saved each other. Your life woke my wolf. And my wolf, it gave you a place to anchor yours." He leaned down and pressed his forehead against mine, his scent of pine and winter enveloping me. "You are my Luna, my mate, my miracle, the hollow bride who filled the emptiness in my own soul." Tears welled in my eyes, but they were tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. I was not a symbol. I was not a sacrifice. I was loved, by a king, by an alpha, by a man who had been willing to die for me, and had instead shown me how to truly live. He kissed me then, a deep, possessive kiss that held all the promises of the future. There was no desperation in it, only the certainty of 1,000 sunrises to come. It was the kiss of a beginning, not an end. When he pulled away, we stood in the quiet of the night, two souls who had been sentenced to death, bound by a curse that had, by some impossible twist of fate, become our salvation. He was the Alpha King, his body healed and his power absolute, and I was his Luna, no longer wolfless, but wolf-filled, a queen of shadow and light. The prophecy had come to pass, but not in the way anyone had foreseen. The dying king had risen, and the hollow bride had been made whole. He took my hand, his grip warm and sure, and together we looked out over the sleeping valley that was our home, our future. And in the quiet dark, beneath a waking moon, our story truly began.